Welcome to this Wise Words academic seminar hosted by the Contemplative Studies Center at the University of Melbourne. I'm Associate Professor Nicholas Van Dam, Director of the Center. We respectfully acknowledge the traditional owners of the unceded land in which we work, learn, and live, the Wurundjeri, Woiwurrung, and Bunurong peoples. We pay respect to elders past and present, and to any Indigenous peoples present today. Today, we're joined by Professor Kathryn Williams, Professor of Environmental Psychology in the Faculty of Science at the University of Melbourne. In today's presentation, Kathryn will explore how contemplative practices, particularly those involving purposeful interaction with nature, can support social and ecological transformation and discuss their potential to generate adaptive responses to ecological challenges. If you have any questions, please post them in the Q&A at any stage during the presentation, and we'll address as many of them as we can at the end of today's session. Thank you and welcome, Kathryn.
Thanks, Nicholas. I'll just share my slides. Are they showing for everyone now, I hope? Cool. So as I begin, I too want to acknowledge Wurundjeri country, which I'm really grateful to live and work on, including the Woiwurrung people, the traditional custodians of this land. I also want to acknowledge my many partners in this research, so co-authors and researchers at the University of Melbourne, but also partners beyond those borders. And I ask you to take a minute to have a look at the amazing list of people who are contributing to this project. It is such a privilege for me to learn from and with these people from such diverse academic, faith and wisdom traditions. As we talk today, I want to make it clear that their ideas and their efforts are evident across all parts of this presentation, but at the same time, make it clear that I'm speaking to you at a point when we're still finalising our analysis. So some of what I'll say is tentative and work in progress, and will develop further as we move forward. So hoping these slides change. Okay. Again, there we go. That changes. So I want to start by outlining the very challenging context in which we offer this work. We face multiple ecological crises, and many people experience distress in response to these crises. But in responding to this distress, we need to think really carefully about the positive or healthy and what we might call negative or less healthy implications of this form of distress. So to dig into that a little bit, one way to think about the ecological crises that we face is through the concept of planetary boundaries. While it's a concept that has critics, it has been really influential, and it's a nice simple way of representing the challenge we face. So over a decade ago, a group of scientists from diverse fields of expertise sought to define a kind of safe operating space for the ecological processes that we, and I mean here humans and more than humans, depend on for our survival. Biodiversity, land and water, processes such as climate change and ocean acidification that can undermine our capacity to meet our needs. When this concept was first published back in 2011, scientists at that time, as best as they could, judged that we had exceeded two of the boundaries that are essential for our safety: biodiversity integrity and disruption of nitrogen cycles. This year, in a review and an update by a very eminent group of scientists, they concluded that we have now breached 6 of the 9 boundaries. While the authors note that there's scope to improve this situation, in many ways this paints quite a bleak picture of the future ahead of us. I want to move quickly from this very abstract perspective of the crises and challenges we have to the personal and psychological consequences of these changes. I teach students in the environmental sciences, and this year I asked them about their personal connections and ecological crises, personal connections with the ecological crises, asking them just to share one example of how they or someone they care about has been impacted by pollution, by biodiversity loss, climate change, and its associated disasters. You may want to use the webinar chat to add some of your own experiences here, or just browse the range of responses that my students share. Their responses show how very impactful these ecological changes are as to the anticipation of a future. For these young adults, it's really significant. We see stories of really material impact, close friends who've lost homes, neighbouring farmers who've lost livelihoods. We see a curbing of their experience and growth. I was quite moved by one of the stories which talked about not being able to play outside, outdoors, because of the pollution impact in a particular part of the world. And we see accounts of psychological impacts, for example, the stress of having bushfires close to one's home, the anxiety of facing a future in a very changed world, and the guilt of feeling that one isn't doing enough. One aspect of this psychological impact can be talked about is eco-distress or ecological distress. So eco-distress encompasses a range of painful feelings that we might experience as we walk through these crises. We might feel anxiety, grief, despair, anger, compassion, and care. You might be wondering what those kinder feelings like care and compassion are doing on this list of experiences. But if you reflect for a moment on a time where you felt compassion or care for someone or something, but couldn't change the situation for them, how distressing that can be. What's really important when we think about eco-distress is, though it's painful, it's actually a healthy response to ecological crises. These feelings are important information about the state of the world. Important information about the planet, important information about the sense of moral injury or betrayal we might experience as we judge there to be inadequate action in response to these changes. Surveys over the past years tell us that ecological concern or distress is widespread and it's increasing. Sometimes this kind of distress can be debilitating. It can disturb sleep, it can undermine social connections. And these kind of reactions are particularly common amongst young people, those who experience higher generalized anxiety, and people who have a stronger connection with nature. Where this occurs, ecological distress can undermine the likelihood that people will take action on environmental issues. More commonly, though, this kind of ecological concern is not debilitating. And one member of our research team was involved in research that demonstrated how ecological emotions of different forms can relate to our motivation to act for change, and recognising the importance of anger, for example, eco-anger for encouraging action. Responding to this challenge, our research team is contributing to the task of developing effective strategies to address ecological distress. The kind of response we make into this situation needs to have some subtlety. It needs to allow for both the healthy and less healthy components of ecological distress. We don't want strategies that simply soothe. And in fact, I can imagine situations where the most effective strategy might actually generate more eco-distress, a greater sense of the pain, of compassion and care. But either way, we need strategies to work with painful feelings in a way that promotes mental well-being, but also provides energy and support and pathways forward for collective and environmental change. So there's the challenge. I'll turn to the vision. So as a group, we recognise that strategies to address eco-distress will be needed at individual, community, national and global scales. And these strategies will involve many, many disciplines and diverse fields of practice. So our work is just one tiny piece of the puzzle and is scaled more at the individual and community level. Our vision is the development of effective contemplative nature engagement practices to address ecological distress. We're wanting to develop strategies based in contemplative nature engagement that are holistic, that aren't simply soothing, but are promoting individual, social and ecological function, that are evidence-based, and that can be easily adapted to different cultural and social settings. There's a bit to unpack there, so I'll jump into that and explain a bit more. So first of all, what do we mean by contemplative nature engagement practices, and why are we turning our attention to these in the face of this great challenging problem? So there's now a large body of work on the mental health outcomes of spending time in natural environments. Nature or natural environments is a bit of a complex word, a tricky word. We'll unpack that a little bit as we go along. But for the moment, you might think of nature as the elements and processes of Earth's lands, water and biodiversity. And you might think of it as at different scales and different forms of human involvement. So you can start with you can not start with, but one element might be a potted plant, a small urban creek, a park, expansive landscapes that we might mistake as wilderness. Much research has examined the influence of simple exposure to this kind of nature on a range of health outcomes. So, for example, exposure might be the presence of trees in our streets or the parks in our neighbourhoods. But research is also looking at the impacts of very intentional experience of nature. I guess the kind of more intentional practices like bushwalking and gardening. Across this body of work, which has grown so much over the last few decades, we see quite consistent pointing towards positive consequences for mental health, including reduced strength, improved concentration, and boosts to mood. A smaller number of studies also point to possible positive consequences of this exposure to nature for our sense of social connection, the likelihood that we'll help other people, and the likelihood that we will act in positive ways for the environment. Members of our research team have contributed to this big body of work through studies into the effects of urban nature on attention control, mood, cognitive function in children, and work productivity in adults. A recent avenue of work has turned to digging deeper into how we engage with nature. So those intentional moments of experiencing nature, what's going on in these. A lot of researchers are looking at the activities we do and how they shape the kind of outcomes that come from those experiences. Researchers from our team have been more concerned with the forms of awareness and attention that we bring to nature experiences. So, for example, Rose McCauley's PhD work, Rose is a member of our team, plays a really key role in this work, and her work has demonstrated that deliberate mind wandering while in a natural environment can reduce negative mood, while mindful decentering can promote positive mood, and that both forms of engagement with nature can promote connection with nature. This line of work brings us closer to the matter of contemplative practices in nature. So we think of contemplative nature engagement practices as purposeful, really intentional, involving a defined set of actions so that they are indeed practices, involving awareness of experience and the inner world, so forms of introspection, but also engagement with nature, whether that's direct or indirect. On the left, you'll see some of the psychological research that we would think of as looking at different types of contemplative nature engagement that have been evaluated or explored through scientific work. But you might also think of in the popular domain, there's a good chance you've heard of Shinrin-yoku or forest bathing, forest therapy, which you can experience at the Botanic Gardens in Melbourne. Some of you may have experienced nature-focused pilgrimages or experience yoga in a natural environment. Some contemplative nature engagement practices have been really specifically designed to address ecological relationships, such as the quite well-known Council of All Beings developed by deep ecologist Joanna Macy. Okay, so hopefully that helps you be clear about what I'm talking about when I talk about contemplative nature engagement practices. The second part of the vision is that we are developing strategies which are holistic in their influence on ecological distress. So in the last decade, there has been a real rush to try and develop effective strategies to address ecological distress and most often anxiety or eco-anxiety. Recent reviews have looked at the range of interventions that have been developed, from inner work through to social connection and spending time in nature. So there's a lot happening out there. Does it work? Do these work? We have less understanding of this. Some colleagues from the University of Melbourne, including one member of our team, recently developed a multiple needs framework, arguing that effective strategies to address eco-anxiety will work at the individual, social and ecological level. So thinking about healthy functioning in all of those regards. They will work individually to help people work with emotions, socially to help people work together, and ecologically in the sense of resulting in more positive environmental action. That team analysed the strategies or interventions that are available for addressing ecological anxiety and concluded that none of them currently address all three of these requirements. Our vision is to try and hold all three of them together through a contemplative nature engagement approach. The third part of our vision is that this work should be evidence-based, and that's just super challenging at this point in time because our academic understanding of both contemplative and nature engagement practices is far from complete, as is our understanding of ecological distress. Most of the work in this field is on either contemplative practices or nature-based interventions. Relatively small number of studies bring these together to understand the impact as contemplative nature engagement practices. A second challenge is that research on contemplative practices has largely been concerned with mindfulness-based meditation. We understand much less about the wider range of faith and wisdom traditions within contemplative practices. And when we look at the research on nature engagement, it's been really broad in approach with very few studies looking at more contemplative approaches. Broadly though, this body of work does help us indicate some potential outcomes and pathways. So in terms of evidence around the outcomes, it does support the potential of these practices to influence not just individual well-being, things like mood, attention control and stress, but also social outcomes like helping others or connecting and feeling less isolated. A few studies support the likelihood of both contemplative practices and nature engagement, supporting nature connection or a sense of connection with nature, and the likelihood of taking environmental action. There's a lot of uncertainty, but certainly not all contemplative practices, not all nature experiences having these impacts, but there's enough there to suggest there's potential. The existing research, that evidence base, also helps us to think about some of the pathways through which these changes might occur. So how does spending time in contemplation in nature do all of this good stuff? Not just make us feel better, but help us, supporting social connection and environmental action. Well, research in both of those fields of inquiry typically points to 3 related pathways to explain how that holistic change might occur. So the first of these is an attention-based pathway in which either training, for example, practicing focused attention, or restoration of attention, for example, by the rest that we experience through spending time in pleasant, undemanding, often natural environments, allows us to improve our attention control. And when we can control our attention, we have a greater capacity for regulating our emotions, our experiences, and our behaviour towards others, which opens the way for more positive social and environmental action. The second pathway in this literature is an emotion-based pathway in which experiencing positive emotions, for example, feeling joy in nature or contentment as we contemplate, these emotions allow a cognitive flexibility, and through that we're more open to shifting our perspective, being open to others, exploring new ideas. So that's a positive emotion pathway that really opens us up to new things. And the third pathway is one that's emerging and is often talked about as self-transcendence. Researchers who write about this talk about different aspects of this. For example, connection with nature is often described as a form of self-transcendence, of being connected with nature in a way that expands our sense of self. Others talk about self-transcendence as a dissolution of our boundaries, so the way that we bound ourselves quite often that kind of dissolves, and we see an expanded sense of self. Others talk about transcendent emotions, so feelings of awe, for example. Researchers working in these areas often are articulating that this larger sense of self fosters care and compassion beyond a narrower sense of self. A few authors have talked about how those pathways might work together. While there's good theoretical reason to think that these pathways play a role in addressing ecological and other forms of distress, very little work has been done to test whether this is the case. So part of our bigger program of work is to explore those pathways as well. So the final part of our vision is that we can develop contemplative nature engagement practices that are relevant across diverse cultural and faith traditions and diverse parts of societies. So both contemplative practices and nature engagement are linked to multiple rich, valuable cultural traditions. But we also know that they can occur in ways that are limited in appeal or openness or inclusiveness, and so become narrowly limited to parts of society, sometimes based on gender, cultural or social background. That's been part of our discussions as a research team and leads us towards thinking about quite high-level guidance that can be then adapted to serve well within diverse cultural and social settings. And I will say that the Contemplative Studies Centre here at the University of Melbourne has been really important to allowing us to do this work, and particularly the support of Cullen Joyce, who's an Insight Fellow in the unit, helping us establishing a broad research team, people from very diverse traditions, that allows us to work towards this outcome. So to sum this up, we know that contemporary secular contemplative practices, and particularly perhaps the mindfulness interventions in the form we might see in apps or mindfulness based stress reduction training are often perceived and perhaps maybe designed to work at more of an individual level and to help people manage their feelings or to soothe difficult feelings. In the context of multiple ecological crises, we need to do a much bigger work, not soothe pain, but help people understand and work with pain, act with and for others, and to energize and people to act for and as nature. If you pause for a moment and look at that last line and see the italicized word in there, you might be wondering, it's there as a hint at one of the puzzles that has been really niggling away through our conversations in this project. And that's to do with the puzzle of how we think about our relationships with the rest of nature, the more than human. In this presentation, I've used the term nature connection a couple of times, and that's a term that's used in psychological research to refer to a sense of oneness, merging, or unity with nature. You might recall that I said earlier that nature connection can be a positive outcome from both meditation and nature experience, but also that people who have a stronger sense of connection with nature are more likely to experience eco-anxiety. So there's a conundrum in this. How do we design contemplative nature engagement practices that promote really healthy relationships with nature, enabling well-being and action? And this complete new framing of relationships, I guess, is where we're going. So we're increasingly, I guess, convinced that one of the ways that contemplative nature engagement practices can help address eco-distress is actually by unsettling the way that we think about ourselves in relation to the rest of the natural world, and drawing us towards acting as nature. I'll say more about that. Okay, so that's the challenge and the vision, and now I want to get down to talking about the work that we've been doing in terms of collecting and analysing data and working together across our large research group. So the work I'll talk about today is part of a larger program that we are just calling into being, really. It's been funded by seed funding in the Contemplative Studies Centre, and we're seeing it as a beginning, a starting point. Given the many gaps and uncertainties in the existing literature, the project is really exploring. We're asking how might contemplative nature engagement practices influence responses to ecological distress. We're focusing on processes to build and extend theory, and we're trying to understand what characteristics of contemplative nature engagement practices might support that range of outcomes that we're interested in. To open our thinking really wide, our project is what might be considered transdisciplinary. So practically, that means working with teachers and leaders of contemplative nature engagement practices in ways that challenge us to bridge academic understanding and contemplative wisdom. Our project involves a review of literature, primarily from psychological domains, interviews with teachers and leaders of practices, and we've recently conducted workshops with a range of teachers to integrate these perspectives. This slide gives you a sense of the diversity of contemplative nature engagement perspectives involved in the project in some way. Having that diversity is really important for a couple of reasons. One is that vision that I talked about earlier of making guidance that can be relevant across many different secular faiths and traditions. But I think too, seeing that diversity is really important for us to try and understand some commonalities across the tradition, particularly as we think about unsettling human nature relationships, which are so culturally embedded. So we need to understand a broad perspective on these relationships. The interviews and our thinking across the project in many ways has been shaped by questioning existing practices or understanding, exploring existing contemplative nature engagement practices in relation to these three dimensions of practice, features, purpose, and worldview. So through interviews, we started by trying to understand these three dimensions. So there's been a number of studies seeking to characterize different features of contemplative practices. And we drew on this to help us think about the forms of attention or awareness involved, as well as actions, things like sitting, moving, and the settings and so forth associated with those practices. But the existing literature makes it clear that we need to go beyond just what we can see within a practice and really understand the purpose and the worldviews that underpin what people actually do. So in terms of purpose, we sought to understand what were the intentions, the outcomes that were being sought by these teachers and leaders. What were they encouraging people to think about? Was this individual well-being, for example, or some larger form of transformation? And we sought to dig deeper into the worldviews that people express, so the belief systems that were guiding that practice. And particularly important to this was exploring their understanding of human nature relationships. So taking you through some of the findings from these interviews and from the workshops as well. I'll start at that deeper level of what we've been learning in terms of worldviews. So it's important as we talk about worldviews to note other researchers of contemplative practices have noted that practitioners and teachers in the West typically have access to multiple belief systems that shape their practices. So, for example, a mindfulness teacher might draw on both science and Buddhist worldviews in thinking about their practice. And that kind of multiple ways of thinking was definitely evident amongst the teachers that we talked with. So, for example, many drew on scientific knowledge about the mental health impacts of nature experience, for example, or of neuropsychology or of ecology to explain their practices, and it formed part of their design logic. Scientific worldviews, we'll note, this is important when we think about human nature relationships, scientific worldviews typically involve breaking the world into small components so that we can explain and predict what's going on in the world. So within these kind of accounts, nature most often figures as an external object with which we interact. It might be resources, for example. The teachers that we talked with also drew on what would be described as relational worldviews. Relational worldviews involve, rather than thinking about objects and their interactions and explaining and breaking down, thinking instead about continually unfolding relationships. So a way of being which is really focused more around the relationships. It's about knowing through experience and subjectivity, and really central to it is ethics of care. So within this kind of worldview, nature is not an external object that we might transact with, but a whole assemblage in which we as humans are enmeshed. You can't break it down. So some teachers definitely emphasize, like Murray Ryden Roshi here in the quote, that there is no separation. Trees, fruit flies, whales, plastic bags, we're not separate from anything. There is no meaningful distinction between self and other within a Zen perspective. A number of teachers also described relational worldviews in which the relationships with the rest of nature were characterized in terms of kinship as family. So this, you can see, is a connection that's not simply of interdependence, but evokes the love and obligation that we associate with family relationships. So here Sarah Jones is talking about Way Upper Work, a First Nation grounded approach, which emphasises that we have kinship with all species. And it doesn't matter where you are, you're surrounded by family, the family of birds outside. You're part of their community. On this slide, we're shifting perspective to think about purposes and the purposes that were shared by the teachers in our interviews. So here's a few short quotes from a range of interviews where teachers described the purpose of their practice. Now, I want to say that self-care, individual well-being was definitely part of the purpose of most of the practices we explored, but most of the time it was only one part of the practice. Interestingly, many of the people we interviewed emphasised a core purpose of dealing well with suffering. So not reducing pain, but working well with pain and difficult emotions. Resisting the idea of self-care as being simply soothing or pushing away those emotions, but working well with them. Teachers often emphasise collective well-being, not just individual well-being, but collective well-being of all beings. And as you saw with as I spoke about worldviews, this is not just collective human society, it's a big collective well-being, a much bigger family. All the teachers emphasise a key purpose around transformation. Sometimes that was described in terms of insight, for example, realising our true nature. Sometimes it was very tangible community transformation. For example, here from Sue Martin, who works within Ignatian and I think Jesuit perspectives, talked about being better faith communities. And I'll note that for all teachers, this kind of transformation included transformation of relationships with the rest of the natural world. So, learning from and with and working with teachers through the workshop, we're now trying to develop a shared understanding of how contemplative nature engagement practices and what characteristics of those practices might help address ecological distress. We want this to be practical understanding to guide the design of contemplative nature engagement practices. I'll note that we're still working on this, so some of these points should be understood as tentative as our group kind of circles round to a shared understanding. But some key points. I think the purpose of contemplative nature engagement practices that are seeking to address eco-anxiety is ultimately about transformation of relationships. And that's broad, with ourselves, with others, with what we call the rest of the natural world. In talking about these processes, we talked about transformation as occurring in smaller and longer cycles of change. And when we think about the role of contemplative practices, we can kind of zoom in and out. We can look at practice sessions and what happens within a practice session, or we can look across a lifelong process of change. And we can think about individual processes, but we can also think about social processes. Rose suggested the image of the fern that you see here on the screens as echoing some of these concerns, and I'm personally really drawn towards this image. It's got these spirals of growth within growth. Each of those spirals unfolds and then unfolds and then unfolds. So we have these beautiful spirals of growth, and we also see them in clusters and in isolation. So it really echoes with some of that thinking about how transformation through contemplative nature engagement practices might work. In our broad discussions, we've thought about the activities and the expressions that how important it is that they are designed to fit with the individual and their needs at a point in time. So, for example, we might think about designing these practices differently for the activist who is just burnt out through constant environmental action and really needs to feel a sense of care and restoration. It might look very differently if we're working with people who perhaps are not paying a lot of attention and maybe would benefit from more unsettling experiences of compassion and of care. And we also talked about the importance of specifying practices to social and cultural context, physical settings and seasons. We have an emerging understanding of the process through which contemplative nature engagement might work in overlapping, interrelated experiences. So we're thinking, if you think down at the bottom of this figure, of the importance of those practices in grounding in the present moment, engaging us in our body, in place, in time. We might think about that grounding as allowing a restoration of our attention, boosting mood, reducing stress. And of these things, establishing a state that allows openness and flexibility in our thinking. Working up this spiral, we might think about that openness, that flexibility, allowing us to experience connection, to experience a bigger sense of self. And when we have those experiences, we establish the potential for new insights. And here, when we're thinking about eco-distress, we're thinking about new insights about our relationship with self, others, and nature. And then sharing those insights with others plays a really important role. Bringing those insights or just sharing experiences can bring insights to consciousness. And really importantly, it can strengthen the social conditions for people to go on and act in new ways. If you look across those kind of pathways, you might recognize echoes of the psychological pathways that I talked about earlier, attentional, emotional, and self-transcendence pathways. But our transdisciplinary engagement is pointing towards other pathways, including grounding in the present moment, insight, and sharing. If there are psychologists tuning in, maybe you can recognize the resonance of this way of thinking with Frederick's broaden and build models. I'm sure there are educators in the room, and maybe you're thinking about how it echoes aspects of experiential learning processes. I just want to say a few more words about the deliberations of our group in terms of this pathway of connection and self-transcendence, because these terms are used in so many different ways. So I just want to point you back a bit and make it clear that in our conversations, this has been aligned with the different expressions of the worldviews. So workshop participants often emphasize that the sense of self-transcendence we're talking about is one where those boundaries are dissolving a little, where we're experiencing this much broader sense of big self. And that connection was not just interdependency, but a connection of kinship, and that this involved reciprocity in which we experience the love and care of trees, of animals, of earth, just as we experience compassion and love for them. So effective contemplative nature engagement practices to address eco-distress. Coming from our workshop, we would argue that it relies on a restorative, physically and socially safe environment that allows trust, compassion and openness in that experience, but also on activities that support this process, including prompting that experience of connection and of a bigger sense of self. So through the workshops, we've identified a range of activity elements that we think could be particularly helpful for achieving these outcomes. And at a high level, they include the range that are shown on the screen. So formal meditation, a staple of most contemplative practices, most often used to ground in the present moment at its most basic level. In the context of nature engagement, that can take on a different sensation, For example, orienting people to notice breath might include orienting them to think about the movement of breath between living beings, recognizing that we breathe with trees and with other animals and with other people, that there's a shared component of this and through this to connection. Another activity element might be attention to nature through the senses, so spending time in natural environments or bringing nature objects into the contemplative space. This is really focusing on sensory engagement, and that's going to be key to being present, but also has the potential to provide a pathway to joy, to reduce stress and restoration, and through these, a sense of connection. The third one, moving through, involves movement through landscapes or settings where literal changes of perspectives and sense of a journey can support a sense of insight. The fourth is visualization and imagination, which often involve forms of guided meditation, maybe bringing to mind landscapes or natural elements such as sun or wind, other beings or memories that we have of nature. These kind of activity elements might activate emotions of joy or of pain, provide insights to care and to important social or cultural bonds that we have with the rest of the natural world. And finally, sharing with others can be based in activities like making bush tea together or weeding, really practical, tangible things that can boost a sense of being able to make a difference, build bonds across a group. But this sharing often also involves joint reflection on experiences. And as I said earlier, that can bring insights to consciousness, foster a sense of social connection and compassion, and potentially orient people towards collective action. I'm going to draw on the interviews to give you a better sense of how some of these activities are brought together within specific traditions or context. So Maya Ward teaches a contemplative practice which she aligns with the concept of co-becoming. And I just love her description of this activity, which combines sensory attention to nature with body awareness and visualization to evoke experience and insights to our connection. So if you read through this edited transcript from the interview, she talks about holding a strawberry in front of you, smelling that strawberry, so very sensory in its approach. But then she prompts participants to activate a reciprocal sense of longing, of that strawberry longing to be consumed, to be transformed, so its seeds can go through you and reproduce. At the same time, your own wonder of feeling or taking that strawberry into a mouth. She calls attention to the body, to chewing, to swallowing, to the stomach, and her narration prompts a sensing of the relationship between the strawberry, our guts, and then imaginatively to an awareness of the bacteria that make us, and back to the earth. And ultimately her process is using engagement, embodied and imaginative sensing of an extended sense of self. She says to feel it from here to here, this whole chain of events. Oh, it's hardly me. This is the earth longing for its own grounding. And I really go, okay, I'm just a participant in something really big, drawing people towards that sense of connection. Another example I really love is from Christina Roundtree. She's a labyrinth walking facilitator with Veriditas. She works within the really, I think it's a very restorative security of a labyrinth landscape, combining activities of moving through nature with a formal meditation in a process that's designed to orient people towards insight. So she describes this purposeful work of towards the center of the labyrinth. And as you walk, you hold, you carry a concern, a person or situation, or indeed the great weight of ecological distress. You carry that with the expectation of finding some kind of clarity and insight. You walk through the middle of this, walk into the center of the labyrinth, you pause with this expectation of insight, and then you walk out again. And Christina describes how the walking matters, the movement through matters, including through these changing viewpoints. Your field of vision changes, you change perspective in this literal way, and at the same time, your insights to the concern that you take change. And she also notes how important it is these well-designed labyrinths create a safe holding space for this difficult this facing of difficult emotions and concerns. So I'll leave it there in terms of what we're exploring and discovering within this project. But as we move towards the end of this project, we are, of course, thinking about all the questions that it's opened up to us, and how much more we long to understand about this world. So one of the aspects of future work is to finalise this high-level guidance to make it available widely. We hope to do that through the Contemplative Studies Centre. We are additionally seeking support to take the project to the next phase. We see that phase as really taking this high-level guidance into specific context and really co-designing what it looks like to take this approach in different settings. For example, community groups who are burnt out from sustained activism, what does it look like there? And then testing to understand both the outcomes through engaging in these practices, but also the pathways through which any change might take place. And finally, a big question for many of the people on the team is how a different way of thinking about nature connection might matter, how that's built through contemplative practices, nature engagement practices, and how it might change us. So I'm really curious about how emphasising kinship and reciprocity might matter in the way that we experience and work with ecological distress. So specifically, what does it mean for our individual, social and ecological function to sense the earth caring for us, to experience the warmth of the sun, the shade of the tree, not just as an ecosystem service, not just as pleasant scenery, but as love. I'll end there and look forward to discussing.
Thank you, Kathryn, for that really intriguing and inspiring talk. Just to the audience, I'll suggest you please remember to post your questions on the Q&A panel, and we will answer them there as they come up. One question, Kathryn, that occurred to me sort of as you were talking, and I think then this is something sort of that we get asked a lot in the center in terms of the work that we do and that we're promoting. Do you see a role for these kinds of activities, not just for communities and activists and people sort of who are already committed to doing something, but for those who actually maybe are recalcitrant or resistant to doing something? And I guess, have you thought at all, or have the discussions amongst the members of your groups and the dialogues, have they explored what that might look like? How would we encourage people to think more about what might need to happen and how we might address some of the issues that we're facing?
Yeah, so I think I was hinting at some of that as I was talking, when I talked about the possibility that some people might need to care more, that sometimes we are not paying attention, and that is a less than healthy response actually to the crises that we face. Yeah, I guess, one of the challenges that I think we face in terms of contemplative practices is that they often are appealing or attractive to quite small groups within society. And often that is people who are more ecologically attuned. So there is a real challenge in thinking about how to design these to be widely available. One of the models that I'm really interested in because of this reason is the Waiapa work approach. Practitioners and teachers from that group are, working in prison environments. They're working with people following floods and fire. There seems to be something slightly different about that approach that I think we can learn from particularly. And so, yes, I think, and I think in that context, there are multiple forms of distress, but there are also people who haven't really given, I should say, and in corporate settings as well. So working in corporate settings. And I'm sure there's many other practices that are offering into that space as well. I think we can learn a lot from those. And, as I said, I think there's a lot to be offered in terms of unsettling assumptions about nature as something we can just use as a resource, and activating the feelings of care and compassion that I think are very much part of all human experience as well.
There's a comment in a similar line that ecological changes can affect well-being at the micro level, but also have an impact sort of at the macro level. And the question is, and I guess this is sort of similar to what we were talking about, but I guess this idea of how can personal contemplative engagement have a wider influence and positive impact on environmental problems? So and it's sort of another question of sort of, this idea that we're transforming individuals. How do we ensure that, the individuals can then transform society? So what's the link between, individuals kind of propagating outward versus, I don't know, or getting the right individuals who have the ability kind of to do things or help us do things, if that makes sense.
Yeah. I think part of that the answer to that lies in, something I said very early on, that contemplative practices are a small part of the puzzle, that we need transformative processes at all scales, in all kind of domains of understanding. So we can't do this alone, and we shouldn't be expecting contemplative practices to carry all the weight, or imagining that they are the solution. They're not, but they can contribute. In our conversations within the project, I think we are recognizing just how important the group work can be associated with contemplative practices or built into them, and that that can do really important different kinds of work. But one of the work that I think is really important is developing and enriching shared understandings of what the challenge is and where the opportunities are, of strengthening social connection and the capacity for collaboration, setting shared language for thinking about the kinds of changes that are needed. And I think in those regards, there is the potential to set the foundations for new ways of thinking and doing. A group can share those deliberations, but then that leads to potentially a conversation about how we, share produce from our gardens in this community, or whatever it is that's holding people back. There is the opportunity there to take that into positive action. I think too, some of the traditions have very much embedded in them very practical work together. So collective work, whether that's in advocacy or weeding, is not just empowering, but does contribute to those bigger and other domains of change processes that we need to make a difference.
Do you think there's potential here to kind of address two problems at once? I was just thinking along the lines of your comments about the importance of the social connection in the group. And I think, we're also kind of faced at present with this sort of unprecedented rise of loneliness, or people feeling isolated. And I guess I'm wondering if, community centers or community groups whereby people are engaging in multiple activities could actually address kind of both of these issues at the same time? And if, you know, there seems to be sort of some interest and support, at least locally, say Vic Health sort of has been, you know, advocating for more kind of community-based programs and interventions. Do you think that is possible or plausible?
I think it comes back to our vision of this really holistic sense of change, and that, you know, that's really aligned with what I'm hearing from the teachers of these practices too, that, you know, caring for the tree whilst you know, not caring for across generations, it just doesn't, you know, that's a problem. That's a problem. Like, this cannot just be about you know, thinking about ecological change. It's the whole assemblage, and that includes you know, the human life that we share, as well as the environment. So inherent in that is this sense of social connection, of feeling the love, care and compassion of other people, and offering out love and compassion to other people as well. So I think, you know, if I reflect on my own field, which has talked a lot about nature connection, when I look at that concept now, it feels very, very siloed compared with the way that this work is encouraging to think. We cannot separate those things. So yes, I think it's inherent in this approach. That's what we're seeking.
And there's a comment of sort of around kind of engaging more with people working in forest therapy, and I guess their motivation to build their community. But I guess a bigger question related to that is, you know, how, I mean, I guess how in the context of sort of the people with whom you engage, it's quite a broad group, and like in terms of your collaborators, like it's quite a wide list of people from really different backgrounds. And I guess it kind of strikes me that you know, we often think of, and as you just sort of indicated, right, we often think of the solutions to particular problems being identified in very limited circles. You know, the mental health crisis being addressed by mental health providers, or, you know, the ecological situation being addressed by experts in ecology. But, you know, I guess what I'm hinting at sort of is part of a broader solution actually involving people from these much wider sets of disciplines. And, you know, by having this conversation more about holistic well-being, and in doing so, do we actually start to not only look after these the thing we want to address, but also all these others, this, you know, wider variety of hosts of problems. And I was just curious if you had any thoughts about that.
Can you put it into a neat question I can answer? Yeah, I think I was distracted by thinking about all the different people that we've been working with, including people from Forest Therapy Association, who you know, bring a really interesting perspective to this. So yeah, put it in a neat question for me.
How does having kind of this diverse stakeholder group change the way you think about the problem?
Okay. So I think like it's been super, super helpful in just so many ways. And maybe I can just think of some, you know, tangible examples of that. So for example, you know, a lot of the really, you know, many of the practices are short-term, single session, series of session interventions, like they're designed to be this way. And that really contrasts with perspectives, say, from Zen Buddhism, which are lifelong practices and really bringing what happens into this whole kind of way of being and doing across one's lifespan. And so, for example, having that diversity really challenged us to think about, well, how do we think about these guidelines and our process, our imagined process or our proposed process of how the transformation happens in a way that accommodates both of those realities, and recognizing the strengths of both short-term interventions and a lifelong practice, and, you know, all the things that might go in between. So that would be one practical example of how it matters. I think it helps us think in a more complex way about how changes might occur, for example. I think it's really important to making sure our guidelines are relevant and could potentially be picked up from different groups. So, you know, many groups have really well-established programs of their own they have their own accounts of how the work of transformation occurs. We want this to be written and shared in a way that makes sense, that people can pick up and see the synergies, see the opportunities, see the things that they're already doing, and maybe think about them and talk about them in a new way, particularly as we move on to expanding the evidence base around how the change occurs.
And there's another question around sort of, I guess, interweaving this, or sort of using this sort of in the context of response to natural disasters or sort of environmental events. I mean, do you think that there's a capacity to, not only, of course, deal with, the acute issues that's, associated with, say, floods or bushfires and things like that, but to also help people that may be experiencing considerable distress around kind of the implications of that long term at the same time? Like, in other words, what do you think it might be worthwhile sort of endeavor to kind of think about having people who are doing the kinds of works that you're generating guidelines for along when we have bushfire responses, so that people who, have lost their homes and are now thinking about, well, do I build another home in the same spot, or do I just, move, locate and move, and like, what can I really do? Would it be worthwhile to, to try and start thinking about the long term along with the acute, when there's floods and when there's bushfires in those communities?
Yeah, that certainly resonates with some of our conversations. So, in the interviews, we could see a number of teachers and practitioners who've been, acting in contexts like that. So working after floods or fires. We could also see, one example was from someone using nature-based mindfulness to work with people who had, from memory, I hope I'm not misrepresenting this, but it was people who had been engaged in land care practices, so restoring an ecosystem, and then that had been removed for various reasons. You can imagine the grief that you'd feel when you put labour and love into restoring the land, and then it is that work is cleared. So working with them in that situation of grief, and so that theme has been part of our conversations, in the workshop as well, of how do you design practices like this to work with people who are, following an event in quite an acute situation. And I guess the other thing is just to say, my hope would be that the high-level guidelines have exactly that potential, so we could, potentially take them and then specify them for working in a situation like that with a group that have experience, for example, in bushfire recovery. I know they've been doing some wonderful work in this area, and that would be a wonderful opportunity to work with people responding to acute situations as part of the mix of recovery processes.
Well, thank you so much, Kathryn, for this wonderful presentation, and for your time answering these complex questions. And thank you to the audience for joining us. Please do subscribe to our newsletter to stay informed about this and other upcoming event series hosted by the Contemplative Studies Center. And we look forward to seeing you next time.
Thanks, Nicholas.